Fantastic. So, Roddy, if we start with you and just have a little chat about this Wigmore Hall programme on Friday. Am I right in thinking that that actually grew out of a bigger programme that you were exploring with Joseph and Carolyn?
Yes, it did. And it was the programme for Friday is actually 2/3 of a programme I did in Milton Court and up in Sheffield about 2 or 3 years ago, which was themed around women's voices, brackets as seen by men, and also an odd theme of birds and nightingales in particular. And it had some Sally Beamish in it and some Rhiannon Samuels, so there were some living female composers on that programme. Now, in squeezing that down to the hour for the Wigmore Hall, I thought I would concentrate on the great German song masters, and I left myself then with only men's voices talking about female experiences, which almost including the one song by Clara Schumann that turns up because she's setting a Rucker. So, so I thought there was a delicious irony about that, and of course the irony was for me was further explored by the title "Woman's Hours," only because the recital lasted an hour, and because I was programming all these supposed women speaking. And then it was on top of that, of course, it's Joe and me performing it. So not even the pianist is female, let alone the singer. But I wanted to explore all sorts of questions. I wanted to ask a lot of questions. I don't necessarily feel I'm going to answer a lot of them. I might answer some of them by the performance, but I wanted to ask a lot of questions about whether that was a thing anymore. Partly because it's not so long ago that Alice was singing Winterreise in Wigmore Hall, not for the first time. And it's not long ago that Madeline was presenting some songs from Die Schöne Müllerin in Birmingham, wasn't it, Maddie?
Yeah.
And he was speaking very convincingly about that, about your preparation of that and how you perceived it. So where I think we are at the moment, and I might be wrong here, where I think we are, is that when you say, oh, Alice Coote is singing Winterreise, there may still be some people who go, oh, really? A woman singing Winterreise? I'm not sure if that's died out completely or what, but what I do know from my point of view is that when I say, oh, I'm going to be singing Frauenleben, there are enough people who say to me, oh, really? A man singing Frauenleben? That doesn't happen often, or are you sure? And then the next thing they ask me is, are you going to sing it as a man or as a woman? Which I think is a very, very interesting question. And we can riff on that if we wish. But that essentially is what the program is about. For me, it's a chance for me to say, is this a thing for anybody anymore? And I would also throw into the mix that when I was preparing the Schumann about 2 or 3 years ago, whenever it was, I happened to have a conversation with Natasha, who was around at our rehearsal for something else, and I mentioned the piece. And Natasha said a few things about the piece, which is actually vital to the way I was preparing it. You were just saying about its context today. It really caused me to think about the character and its political context now. And you also recommended that article by the academic whose name I've conveniently forgotten. And I went and read her article, and it was very interesting to see her kind of dismantle the whole of the piece. I felt a little bit uncomfortable then. I wasn't sure how to recover from that. But actually, it was speaking to singers such as Carolyn and having a long chat with Sarah Connolly about the piece, of people who love the music anyway, that gave me confidence that there was something still in the piece worth searching for, and it's worth exploring. So that is a big overview of how it all came to be.
I just love to touch on something you said there. I mean, Alice, when you sing Winterreise, do people ask you, are you going to sing it as a man or as a woman?
Yeah. Well, no. Maybe they should have done, but that just strikes me as hilarious, because how could I sing it as a woman? I mean, I know that Joyce DiDonato just felt that she wanted to push it one further when she did it in December, about the same time as I did my last one. She decided to say, well, what about the woman? What about the woman left behind? And she interpreted it at Carnegie as a once removed reading of the text as if it was a diary left behind. So it was inflected with, what do I feel about what he's saying about me? What do I feel about this person that is going away from me, that's left? And what his ultimate demise, and how responsible am I? But we took it an extra step further. But all of these things are fascinating. I've only ever, I don't really, I've had all sorts of questions asked, but never directly, are you doing it as a man or a woman? Because maybe the look on my face didn't allow them to ask that question. But I couldn't possibly sing it as anything other than a human. So I couldn't sing it as a man because I'm not a man. I can sing it as a woman because I am a woman, but that's not the most interesting thing to me. But then that makes me ask Roddy, why was he drawn to sing Frauenleben, and who does he feel he is getting as he gets towards the performance? What is his feeling about it? It's really interesting.
It's a little tricky, that, and actually it's a question that plays in my mind as I'm practicing it, and I feel it's a question that will be in my mind as I'm singing, because to a certain extent I am playing a character in the same way that when I sing Death and the Maiden, which is the 3 Schubert songs that begin the program, when I'm singing them I'm narrating the Maiden and then I narrate Death, so I inhabit both to a certain extent, well, as much as I can in the song. So it's not a leap to imagine that when I'm singing any of the other female characters in my program, that I inhabit them in the same way. Exactly the same way that when I inhabit the Miller in Die Schöne Müllerin, I inhabit a much younger person. And it's a version of myself, but the actual nitty-gritty of gender it doesn't so much come into it as more than the human emotions that bubble inside me when I'm singing. So in one sense, I can imagine as I'm singing Frauenleben, I can never say it, sorry. As I'm singing the Schumann, let me just rest with that. As I'm singing the Schumann, I am kind of imagining I'm in my own film of it, and I'm playing that character. And as I'm doing it, there's a part of me, one of the little voices that's out here saying, Roddy, I notice you're singing very lightly here. Are you doing that because you think that's feminine? Or are you doing it? So I'm asking myself this question all the time. Would Frauenliebe und Leben not be permissible for someone who doesn't identify as a meek young maid? So if the audience are looking at someone who doesn't look like a meek young maid, are they going, oh, well, I don't believe that, might as well be a man singing, crikey. I think not. I think that, well, I'm not going to answer these questions I'm asking, sorry. But
that's so interesting though, isn't it? Because, oh goodness, that's the sort of questions that I've had to ask myself endlessly if I've done Dichterliebe or if I've done Winterreise. Because obviously on stage, I've played since I was in my 20s, I've been asked to play a man physically. I've been asked to be a man. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole different thing to standing in song where you are just in your mind, through the text, through entering a human being through your mind. It's not really about inhabiting the body. So, but at the same time, I'm so conditioned to think, there's so many things about it, it's so interesting. Shall I strengthen what I'm singing here emotionally, or the way my voice sounds? Shall I make this phrase sound slightly more straightforward or less straightforward? The tone of voice, the color, the way I use rhythm, is it stronger, is it weaker? Shall I be myself? Shall I be who I interpret to be a man? Who am I even? Am I feminine? Am I masculine? As a person, even me. What does that say about me? It opens up so many questions, and I end up going, there is no answer, and it actually asks so many interesting questions about what it is. You end up not knowing who the hell you are or who anybody else is, and that's kind of great.
Well, I'll put it out there just for you all to think about. In the time that I have coached at schools and conservatoires, basically the next generation of people coming through, no woman has ever brought me the Songs of Travel or Butterworth Shropshire Lad. Or, I mean, I have, of course, I haven't, of course, in my time studied many songs that you would normally think, oh, that's a woman's song. I haven't, whatever we list as being things that only women are allowed to sing. But, so I don't have that. My repertoire is male orientated, I think, so far. And no young singer has ever brought me something that steps outside of that until Madeline brought Middleton to me, and I just thought, that is amazing, and then I thought and she's on her own.
Maddie, what were you thinking when you took him?
What were you thinking?
Yeah, why?
Well, I'd always wanted to do like a Schubert cycle. I think especially with that one, it was just such a linear story, which I really liked, and I found not easier. I mean, there was just a very clear songs. Here's what's happening in it, and I actually quite liked that. Looking at it through a different lens and reading the text. So like my response to something would be different to a guy's response, like Amplifier like sitting in a group of big gruff men would make me feel different as opposed to if anyone else was sitting there. And I think I was just really drawn to it for that slight, I don't know, I just think it leaves a different taste in one's mouth, like depending on who is singing it, because it's.
So to be clear, Maddie, you and we did discuss this a bit at the time. To be clear, you were presenting Middleton very much with you as being a female in that situation.
Yeah. So it was the whole cycle. I did semi-staged for my final performance at Birmingham, and I mean, looking back on it now, I'm not sure. It was a year ago. I'm not sure whether how differently I'd do it, but. It was kind of what Alice was saying about, I was like, am I a tomboy in this? And like, should I be singing this like masculine? Like, I did decide to take it down. I'm a soprano, but I did decide to take it down to middle voice. And I don't know whether that was to get it more like grounded, because I felt like that's what was either intended or was expected of the piece. But no, it is interesting, yeah, the singing lightly to be really, really feminine. I was doing something similar with sounding a bit more gruff, I guess.
It's interesting, isn't it? Can I just sort of butt in on that and just say that whole thing about this idea? You know, sometimes you meet somebody and you see them and then they speak and it surprises you. It's exactly that sort of, why do we think, you know, sometimes you see somebody who you think is going to have sort of a small speaking voice. I'm not talking about singing here, I'm talking about just in real life. And real life, not that singing is but it's exactly that. And so it's really rather basic that we have this idea, and I mean it's one of the fundamental things that we're trying to talk about, I suppose, but that idea that the man has a deep voice, which is silly because of course we have our tenor heroes and all that sort of thing. But this rather basic characterization that we use, so the young maid must have a high voice or that sort of thing. It's all, yeah, it's all a bit basic, really, isn't it?
What else do they have?
We all feel it, it's there.
I was wondering that with what you say, I find there's a lot of Britten songs I feel like I can't really sing, and I'm not sure whether it's because in my head I'm picturing like a boy out on a big field, or like Songs of Travel, or either it's like, is there, and they're written quite recently, so I'm not sure whether I've just got a really clear idea in my head of what kind of voice should be singing that, because it's either like I've listened to Ian Bostridge sing it, so that's how I think it must be done. I actually don't want to touch it because of that. So yeah, it is interesting. I'm still trying to figure out which other composers I'd really like to sing for that reason.
And sometimes when, I'm sure of us are thinking, when you have something like this, scientifically, you just have to test it. And you just have to go further down the line and think, okay, what could I definitely not sing and why? What would be ridiculous to sing and why? And then as soon as you get to that line, you think, oh no, I could probably do that. There's that line in the sixth song.
I hope. I'm praying it's going to involve your womb.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well,
I want to hear about your uterus.
It's more actually if I may make so bold, my breasts. When the girl is saying, when the mother at this point is saying, only someone who suckles a child really knows what it is to love. And only a woman knows happiness and knows love. And then she says the line which will have people howling into their chips. She says, "Oh, I pity men who can't experience this feeling." I quite like that. I love that line. And part of it for me is the irony. It's like the irony of Cleopatra in Shakespeare, talking about being portrayed by some trumpeting boy or something. I don't remember the line quite, but the whole idea that at that time women weren't allowed on stage, so they had to be represented by boys. And Shakespeare knows this, so he writes it into the script. And the irony is right in front of your face. So it is that moment in the Schumann where anybody who's thinking, well, perhaps Roddy's pretending he's fallen in love with this man because he is a man and it's a sort of homosexual take on the whole thing. And you try and run with that ball as far as you can up until that moment. Can
I just butt in? And I won't butt in again, I promise, for ages. But I really want to know, there's a few places. One of them, of course, is the one where you say, and even the women argue about it, where you say, I will always serve him. I want to, I will always look up to him, and my life will be dedicated to him because I put him on such a spiritual pedestal. But the other one, I'm just longing to know, surely when you actually get to sing it, the part where you say, I can feel this heartbeat beating, when he I'm already believing it's you, he says to his partner that there is a reason why there's this tear in my eye. It's because there is a new life growing inside me. And I will wake up one morning and it will be a reality, and it will be the image of you. And it will be our child. I want to know, Roddy, when you're in the studio on your own and you get to those lines, all jokes aside, what is that experience for you to actually sing that? And are you singing that wanting to experience that yourself? Because I know when I go through male experiences, I want to experience. Are you doing that very much as yourself, or as your and people that you've been close to, your wife, or people? Who are you then?
I imagine that, like any human being who does what we do, you throw your imagination as far as you can. And as an opera singer and as a song singer, I've been required to imagine many things far beyond my human experience. I've killed, I've raped, those are the two that come immediately to mind. There are other things I've done on stage, but those are the easiest ones to think that are as far from Roderick Williams as I could ever hope. But I've looked into that character and tried to imagine what it's like. So those are moments where I am aware of a tenderness and a depth of feeling that must be within me somewhere, and I'm trying to explore it as far as I can reach. But it is no further than a woman who sings this cycle, who has a womb, but is young and is, I don't know, but hasn't ever experienced that herself.
Like me. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that really, that feels like it kind of sums up the whole thing about what all of us do the whole time, though, because I feel when I'm playing this piece, I've been really surprised coming round to yours, Roddy, and kind of playing it through with you, how gender, any gender, seems to suddenly not have any importance, because when I'm playing these songs, I'm feeling all of these things as well. And maybe it's because right now my wife's up twice every night breastfeeding that it feels kind of very, very close. But I don't think there's much in that piece that I've not actually felt. And certainly playing it for many, many different artists, I think the best thing about being an accompanist is that you feel like you're trying on the clothes of lots of different humans, and the whole time kind of drilling down to the most kind of pure human condition. And when you first brought up this whole project, I kind of was a bit like, really, could we not do something else? You know, I wasn't a massive fan of it. And it's really grown and grown and grown, I have to say. And also, I think a piece like that, which I reckon is the first kind of song cycle I ever played. And I reckon I've probably played it about 100 times now in gigs. And so it's something that I feel like I know quite well. And I have to say, I also love it. I really, really love every bar of that piece. I know there are many thorny issues in there. But I think Schumann pads out and through his own lens gives us life, gives us, you know, stuff that we've all felt or can imagine. But when I played it through for you for the first time this week, I felt like I heard it for the first time again. And so I think if this project that we do spectacularly crashes and burns, it's done one thing which makes it feel like I've tried this song cycle for the very first time. And I think that's really cool.
Joe, without wanting to embarrass you, you were also saying that your favourite recording of Frauenliebe is Alice's first recording. She's wincing now. Why is that?
I don't know. I heard that when I was at music college still, and it just knocked my socks off. I just thought it was just so beautiful, and that thing that we're always all searching for, which is simple. You know, that thing of just direct, heart to heart. Feels like there's no filter there, there's no crap. It's just somebody speaking to you. And I think that also kind of sums up what we're all trying to do as well, is that it's, and I think that's why this whole gender thing has kind of interested me more than I thought it might do, particularly this week when I've really got stuck into it, is that it's all about the human condition, and then kind of gender doesn't really come into it in such a way. It's more, yeah, it's more kind of taking away anything that's sentimental and just being completely truthful.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to bring in 1 minute of history since you invoked history at the beginning. Sorry, and also thinking of your very first question, if this is really still a thing. And in a way, it is a bit of a shame in 2020 that we even have to ask the question. It shouldn't be a thing. I think I get the sense that all of us are agreed that it shouldn't be a thing. I hope I'm not misinterpreting for people. I have to hold my hand up and say that it's not a cycle I like, and it's not a cycle I feel I could listen to anymore. Because I feel, this is not a judgment on Schumann or anything like that. I feel it upsets me actually to see women portrayed that way, and I would not need to put myself through that again. I think there's a lot of other music out there, and perhaps this is something about the particular power of cycles that I sort of both admire and mistrust, because song cycles are works of power, they're works of prestige. I don't know if you know, I do things like building a library, and Katy will know this because she also does things like building a library, and there's a certain prestige around those works, what gets picked for building a library and what doesn't. And when you get those 80 CDs through the door and you realize that 76 of them are recorded by men, and that Radio 3 doesn't really want you to feature the 4 or 3 by women anyway, because those are the outliers. And when that happens again and again, it becomes depressing. So while I would love to say that I love Schumann unreservedly, that's actually not true anymore. And I do not feel that this cycle, speaking as a wife and a mother, has much to say about my own experiences of those two things. So for me, I think good for you, Roddy, sing it, upset a few people, let people remember that these experiences are both universal and equally not universal. They don't have to be. We can just do that act of ventriloquism for a performance, but that does not reduce our experience to that set of boxes, I would say.
Carolyn, do you ever find it difficult singing that cycle as a mother?
Well, I don't sing at all, but I'm enough of a historian to know that when the early performances of the cycle were given in the 19th century, they were given by men, and nobody was bothered about it. That was completely fine. At this point, I'm just going to get this to help me have this.
Yeah, hooray! Yeah.
I can't believe you're the only one drinking.
Very good reason to have dry vocal cords.
Yeah, sorry, this is my excuse. I am actually just moistening my vocal cords as I tell you that in 66, am I going to get this date wrong now? It was the baritone Julius Stockhausen who gave the premiere of this work. And when you look at the reviews, nobody was terribly bothered about the fact that he was a baritone. And it was really only a bit later that reviewers start commenting in Austro-Germany about the fact that, it is, why is the mezzo Amalia Joachim singing Winterreise? But this is happening 20 years after these premieres have taken place. And when Katy and I were gossiping about this conversation earlier in the day, we were talking about the impact of recording history and the 1950s in particular, the golden era of the box sets, which is when people bought those handsome boxes of complete Fischer-Dieskau recordings, and that sort of set a pattern of what good performance was, which has become really, really difficult to shake. And I think we have learned a great deal from those recordings. I still have my precious box sets, but it is a pity when those then start acting like bars of a jail for our practices.
Can I ask then, Natasha, does that say something about the performance practice of the time then? Because we're all talking very much, us singers here, about inhabiting the character and, feeling as much as we can those emotions. And so do you think that wasn't such a thing in those days? If the men were merrily singing about having babies and experiencing a mother's love, maybe we're all over, we've changed our performance practice from that point of view.
I think people understood lyric poetry in a different way. It was perfectly fine for people to express those emotions. Also, I think this is something to do with institutions as well. So song singing was sort of, it happened under the radar for a long time. It wasn't important enough repertoire for people to want to say how it should or should not be done. And there was a great freedom to that. As soon as things start getting taught, as soon as they start getting professionalized, then it is in the interests of those who hold power to tell people how it should and should not be done. But for a long, long part of song performance history, it just, it was used as concert fillers very often, a little bit of a nice treat in a recital. And so nobody really seems to have worried about it. Very often in reviews, if songs were performed, people just didn't even mention them. They just said, oh, and so sang, and that was fine. And there's a wonderful freedom to being under the radar, because you can basically do what you like. Once the bar is set, then we are constantly comparing. And I was thinking about Madeline's great courage in bringing something like Schöne Müllerin to a conservatoire context. And there is a lot of fear around young musicians about getting things wrong. And I did wonder, thinking about Roddy, would you have done this, Roddy, when you were a student? Would you have been able to do it?
When things were in black and white, you mean back then? No, no. It wouldn't have occurred to me, for one thing, because part of this conversation has been spurred on by my own children, who are teenagers now, who think me in the nicest possible way. You should have been there in lockdown. In a nice possible way, it's a bit of a dinosaur in this area. So I have been tutored by them more than once on my own use of language. It's very, very interesting. Part of this whole idea for me was that I programmed the Brahms Zapische Order for a competition once, the Gruner competition it was in the 90s, as part of my final thing. And you had to submit all your choice, and they sent it back to me and said, sorry, you can't sing that song, it's a woman's song.
Really?
And I looked at it, and now I say, really? But at the time I didn't. I said, oh my God, this is what you said about young singers and feeling I got it wrong. So, oh my God, how could I be so stupid? Obviously it's a woman's song, just look at the text. Anyway, I think that was someone else's prejudice, and I don't think they're alive anymore, so that's all fine.
The thing is that in our experience, in our job, in our world that we inhabit, all of us, every single one of us on this call, is that we are still, I mean, things are changing day by day, but we are all still relying on the works of male composers to show us anything of women's experience in life. And Roddy, you're lucky, because quite frankly, all of the major song cycles really, maybe apart from this one, until very recently, I mean relatively recently, if you wanted to experience what a man was feeling about life, love, his inner world, it was there from composer to artist. But then that still begs to me the question of, there could be 5 million men and they could all feel differently about one subject. As Natasha has said, she feels very, very differently about being a mother. So she doesn't at all relate to this experience of a man interpreting what it is to have a child, to fall in love, and that life, those little snapshots of life. But we are, up until now, just women's voices aren't in our repertoire necessarily to say, this is what it felt like to give birth, this is what it felt like to lie in bed next to somebody and say, I'm pregnant. So I'm grateful, and I think a lot of female singers are grateful, and it's quite tragic that we're grateful in a way, just that Schumann tried to capture those experiences. And I think I do identify, even in some of the ones that are the most contentious, of about when you fall in love with someone, you want to almost subsume your own identity. You would do anything for them. And I would fall in love with someone and feel that I want to serve him. I want to serve him with my whole life. So it's a mixture of things, and there's many, many different feelings. I'm quite confused about feeling grateful for that documentation of a woman's life, but it's been written by a man.
Yeah.
Can I please just do a shout out for Cheryl's cycle?
Yeah.
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 Absolutely revelatory, because I had a bit of Frauenliebe overdose, and I went to an RCM concert at the Royal College of Music where I work, and a group of young singers did one of those sort of mixed concerts which tend to happen in conservatoires, and a selection of songs from Cheryl's cycle was performed, and I sat up and I listened and I roared with laughter. And that was the point where I thought, I identify with this. And that's not because I haven't been passionately in love, or because I don't adore my children, or whatever other boxes I have to tick in my life, but because I thought that the poetry that Cheryl had chosen and the settings that she had made, I did not have to apologize for loving those songs. And they stopped me in my tracks. And one of the things I learned from that experience is how very lazy I am when it comes to seeking out new repertoire. And I have made much more of an effort since then. There are cycles by women, and the poetry is sometimes fine and the poetry is sometimes less fine, and that doesn't worry me so much, because I do not think that Shamisa's poetry is anything to shout about, since we are having this conversation. There are things out there. I think that one of the things we haven't talked about is audiences, and how difficult it is to try and guess what an audience will take or not take. So that would actually be a very interesting thing to hear about from the performer's point of view. How far do you feel you can take a risk? Where can you take those risks? And where do you risk falling off a cliff because you're going to make everybody upset? You're challenging their expectations.
And does it matter if you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Sodom. Oh, sorry, I can't say that. But before I apologise for that, Can I just exactly that? Just edge out of the. Can I just ask Cheryl, because I didn't get to hear that? Can you tell me a bit more about that, please? Because of course I'm fascinated to hear the response, your response to Schumann.
So I wrote it 10 years ago now, and it was having tea with Jennifer Johnston. She was sort of bemoaning the fact that she loved the music, but she didn't like singing the poetry. And we had a friend in common, Sophie Hannah, who is a best-selling novelist, but she's also written lots of poetry, you know, about relationships and life and things. And we decided it'd be a wonderful thing to write a reaction to the Schumann.
Yeah.
I mean, it was fantastic for me because it gave me, you know, a lot of the songs are perhaps reactions to. I mean, I love the music, and a lot of the music and the piano and the voice is directly inspired by the Schumann. But it was a really fun, exciting thing to do, sort of to add some more contemporary views. So there's one of my favourite songs to write. It was about a woman. It's called Rubbish at Adultery, and it's about a woman having an affair with a man who's always sort of moaning, "Oh, I can't, I'm so awful, my wife and children." And she's saying, you know, if you're going to do it, just do it and have fun and stop moaning about it, you know. And I really, you know, and then there are other songs about there's a song about one night stands. There's a song about having children, you know, and it's interesting for me because I've written songs about soldiers in World War I. I've written, you know, one of these, it's called Antenatal. It's about going to the antenatal classes and then having this child. And, you know, I don't have kids. It took me, you know, I had to use my imagination, just like I had to use my imagination about being in the trenches, really. And I just really try and feel the emotion as strongly as I can.
Would you think it ridiculous if a tenor, I assume there was, well, for Jenny, well, if they're Jennifer, I might be able to sing them. Would you think that would be ridiculous?
No, I think it would be really interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
On the spot.
Yeah,
she kind of has to say yes, Roddy.
Carol, magnificent.
Yeah, you should definitely sing them, Roddy. Yeah.
You know who I thought of? This is very unfair because he isn't part of this conversation, but I thought of Nicky Spence. And I thought that Nicky would absolutely, he would have people on the edge of their seats. It was really lovely actually to laugh in a song recital. I think very often we feel like we have to be in ultra serious mode, and sometimes that is the right thing, but my goodness, it was fun to laugh, and it felt so, it's a horrible word to use, but it felt very relevant. It felt very current. So rather than pretending you are this perfect 1840s woman, which I actually don't really believe existed, having read enough women's diaries from the 19th century. I think this is pure fantasy, and I'm not really interested in those fantasies anymore. I thought that Cheryl really hit the spot with that cycle. It was great. And the other thing, just because I'm aware that Katy hasn't said anything, and Katy and I have had so many fun conversations about this topic. If we look at the history of song performance in Britain in the 20th century, it is much more subversive and mischievous and playful, I think, than we allow ourselves now. I'll hand over to you, Katy, now while I carry on.
How thoughtful, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, I was involved with a podcast a couple of months ago now on the role of female composers in the history of the Wigmore Hall. And one of the things that becomes apparent in the early years, and actually it links into what Natasha was saying about the place of the song in the later 19th century as being a less central genre, that unless you are singing a great big cycle, that actually it doesn't equate to being as important as a symphony or a piano sonata or whatever. You still get in the early years of the Hall that kind of miscellany programming of very diverse groups of performers coming together to put together an evening or a lunchtime concert. And in British late 19th century history, of course, the parlour song is such a big part of what is getting written and performed. So there is a role for women in professional performance and also in domestic performance. So in the first season of the Wigmore Hall, there were 187 concerts, and 79 of them contained pieces by women.
Wow.
79 of them. I mean, you think of the kind, that's nearly 50% of the concerts contained, which is, of course, we are now a long way from that in a lot of venues that are now working very hard to try and regain that balance. Actually, Frauenliebe gets performed a lot, but my sense of looking at the first kind of 30 years of the hall, it gets performed 14 times in the first 30 years. Winterreise gets performed once in its entirety. Is actually the reason it's getting done is because it's short, which means it's much easier to program. I mean, something also that we've kind of touched on, this question of universality of emotions, is actually thinking about, if we think about the Schubert and Schumann cycles, if we just stick to the cycles, the kinds of very emotional, weeping, wandering through gardens, talking to flowers, kind of male protagonists that we are meeting in the 1850s, 40s, 30s, 20s, do not conform to a kind of macho man definition as we might now have it. And actually it's interesting, you know, kind of hearing all of the performers talk about different aspects of masculine repertoire that may or may not feel appropriate to sing themselves. That, for example, the miller in Müllerin, he's young and he's not as strong as the other guys. Whereas perhaps one could argue that the protagonist in Winterreise is much more physically robust because he walks and these terrible conditions that he's surviving. But if you then look at Dichterliebe or the Kernerlieder of Schumann, there's this weird, particularly in Kernerlieder, you sort of move between this very macho hunting horn, you know, off to change the world kind of songs, and then also the weeping in the garden over the flowers kind of songs. So what emotional worlds one may inhabit and associate with a masculine or a feminine role is very much in question, because lyric poetry allows for all of those things across male and female roles. And of course, the kind of the problem of the 1950s box set that Natasha mentioned, the Fischer-Dieskau records all of the Schubert Lieder except the ones that are definitely for women, is that it means that all the ones that are not definitely for women or men become subsumed into the ones that are for men, just by sheer dint of the fact that he records all of them except the ones that have got, you know, Mädchen or Nonne or something in the title. So there's a much bigger grey area in a huge amount of lead repertoire that sits between the song that specifically mentions pregnancy and song that specifically mentions something that perhaps we would think has got to be more straightforwardly what we might call macho male. There's this huge middle of the Venn diagram that is open anyway.
Doesn't that ask a really big question then? Because isn't that saying that all of the why do we asking, and why going back to, is it a thing? That question, which of the experiences in all these cycles do we feel that we've got a thing about actually witnessing Roddy singing or witnessing me singing? Or is it this grey area? Are we all sort of like just about okay in 2020 with most of it being all right? Or do we still feel a bit squeamish, or are we worried about some of the audience will feel a bit squeamish about Roddy becoming pregnant? I mean, what is that? Are we answering, do we still have a thing or do we not have a thing?
Can I jump in there very quickly? If you're talking about squeamishness, in the 19th century, most women who sang the cycle only sang the first half, because being pregnant for anyone was a little bit too much biology on the stage.
Wow, that's amazing.
Worth remembering that, you know, that kind of squeamishness is, again, it's not gender specific. It's the whole the whole idea of it upset people, and that is another. You know, the first time I found that out, I thought, oh, what cowardice! What's wrong with being pregnant? But then I thought about the question a different way and thought, well, what's wrong with singing half the cycle? Why can we not just do the bits that we feel speak to us? What is the? Again, it's a different kind of rigidity that forces us to sing the entire thing, and then you end up with problems of range and problems of transposition and tessitura, vocal comfort. You know, it opens up a whole other can of worms. I suppose ultimately, when you look at the freedoms which history has given us, you think, well, why do we need any of these rules? What is it that prevents us from doing what we feel good about doing, which ultimately communicates itself to an audience? I think if an audience sees performers really free and happy on stage. They might be uncomfortable for the first 5 minutes if their expectations are being subverted, but then they will relax and they will enjoy it. So this is a completely untested theory because I'm not the person on the stage doing this, but I would be willing to hazard a guess.
Well, just on that point alone, Natasha, that my experience with singing Schubert cycles in English has taught me a little bit of that. And in fact, I generally speaking go into bat and explain to the audience that if you know the cycle really well, it's going to irritate you for about 5 minutes. And then hopefully you'll be able to relax after that. And that, of course, that gives them permission to spend the whole of the first song going, oh my God, this is all that stuff. and then let go. And then by the end, in most cases, they really have got into it because they can understand what's been going on for once in a kind of different context.
I heard Graham Johnson saying that he thought that maybe people, Schubert, I think he was talking about Schubert, was at a time when he thought he would join many songs together and it would make songs which weren't being taken particularly seriously. I don't know if any of you else heard him say that recently, into a larger work similar to a symphony. But I'm very grateful for, even in Frauenleben, for a chance to be alone, a bit like a solo theatre work, but with incredibly great poetry and great music, to watch a human being, whether it be Roddy inhabiting that journey, or whether it be any human being inhabiting one journey. And I think we'd be lost without the song cycle if people just dipped in and out because they couldn't sing the high notes or the low notes, or they felt that they weren't going to stick through with that human experience, which I think is one of the greatest achievements of those who actually did put together songs and make them into song cycles.
Yeah, it's unlikely that Schubert or indeed Schumann would have expected any of their cycles to be performed as a whole, because that just wasn't done in those days, neither in the 1820s nor into the 1840s. So it was well after Schumann's death that this becomes a thing, if we're talking about a thing. They would have expected them to be published as books, and then people would pick what they like out of those books. So again, it's the joy of being under the radar, that you can, do what you like, what suits your voice, what makes you happy, what you can play. There are a lot of notes in those cycles as well. So, if you're accompanying yourself or if your friend is accompanying you, then, you have that freedom to play what suits you technically, both from a pianistic and a vocal point of view. For me, I suppose I'm all in favor of freedom. I'm not in favor of arbitrary rules, which ultimately don't really matter. It's not life and death. The only thing that matters is that the performance communicates for me. But I am really aware that that's not how everybody feels about it. And they need those rules and practices to be re-invoked in order to feel comfortable in the concert situation.
But we've just put those conventions on ourselves, haven't we? And, and for example, great hall like the Wigmore, you do often as a performer, as a recitalist, you feel that you have to do things in a certain way because that's the way it's done. And it does feel quite brave to try and mix something up a little bit. And, I don't do wild and wacky programming. And I think also I get braver as I get older. And more experienced. So, back to that question, would you do this as a student? And actually, in a way, we should be encouraging exactly the students to do it and, come along, tear up the rule book, because as you say, it's an arbitrary rule book.
Isn't the whole point of all of it, of all of what we're doing, is to try and show to each other, and what the composers were doing, what the poets were doing, try to show to each other what's inside us. And the fact, I'm just so grateful, and I just wish I could be on the front row, but I can't, and I'll listen to Roddy going through that journey as a woman. Isn't it the whole point that we're just throwing open the doors wide on our heart, wide on our soul, wide on our minds, and grabbing whoever will say anything to us, and standing there and saying, this is my interpretation of what that person said and what they felt when they felt this most intense experience of being a human being, enough to write it down as a poem or write it down as a piece of music or both. So isn't it our job to say, and I can't believe we're still saying it, that on Friday, wow, let's all get on the internet and go on Zoom and talk about Roddy saying he's going to be pregnant in 2020. I mean, it's in a way, it's shocking and appalling, but great, but shocking and appalling again, but great. But it's sort of, maybe turning on its head. Maybe there's been so much, we've heard from men so much, that we're sort of getting shocked now that a man is singing about being a woman, because all the men have ignored doing Frownley Labour because they had so much other stuff they could be singing. And now we're all going in 2020, oh, Roddy's going to sing about being pregnant. And we're all going, whoa, but it can't be about, God, I need to shut up in a minute. We can't be about the fact that we're now shocked at him, the gore of birth, because I think we're all over that now. But it must still be that we're going, is he going to go there? Is he going to say he's pregnant? And that still is a thing, isn't it?
I think I was really surprised at quite how cross people seem to get online at the whole concept. This idea that you're kind of stealing what the woman's thoughts, even though they're not actually her thoughts after all. I mean, did you expect that it was going to cause quite this much angst?
I have been protected slightly from the full weight of the social media storm. You know, what, a tweet and a half or whatever. I've been protected from it because I haven't really sought much of it out, and also I don't wish to engage through social media platforms about this, because I really want to ask these questions. All the questions asked today, I want to provoke the questions and allow people, particularly younger singers, to come out and think, oh, I thought that was going to be a thing. Now I've thought about it, I realise it isn't. And all the rules that Natasha's been talking about just kind of evaporate under an inspection. So someone was saying, I think Natasha or Katy, one of you was saying about audiences, and you know, there's a little bit of thing. I don't, you know, they do pay my wages. I don't want to lose them, but I do really want younger singers, the next generation, represented by Maddie, to be bold and think, well, I've always loved this piece, but I've never felt I could sing it, and now I realise that there's nothing stopping me. So I'm hoping that there will be a raft of singers now bringing all sorts of things to me that they might not have felt comfortable before, for reasons that we cannot possibly fathom.
I was wondering whether it's, again, it's perhaps a bit of a meditative thing for the audience, and like it's a good thing in both aspects, because on one hand, it's not necessarily ownership of a piece, but everyone has like a very personal experience with each piece, like whether the first time they heard it, it was a guy. So for Winterizer, for example, and they've always had what they would expect to be quite a masculine voice guiding them through this journey. But it's also nice that with Frau'n Liebe und Leben, I can reflect on what I expect and whether, sorry, I can't think how to say it, but like, he didn't do this how I would have done it. But what does that say about me and like my preconceived ideas of what a woman's experience is?
Because that's exactly the conversation I'm having when I'm performing, when I'm singing it. I'm trying to second guess, am I doing what you think you expect to see?
Yeah.
It's a weird thing, because I can feel in inhabiting a role and playing a role to a certain extent that I can feel myself doing all those things. In fact, I find maybe I'm not grown up enough yet to let go of those things myself. And maybe whoever comes and sings this piece next will be able to discard the sort of things that I'm already, that form me now. And maybe future performers will be able to just take it off into a different direction. And also deal somehow with the very issues that have caused Natasha, for example, to fall out of love with the piece. I don't know whether it can be brought back into the 21st and 22nd century and beyond. It may well be that this piece loses its currency into the future as, say, Cheryl's pieces gradually, take on muscle. Who knows where we're going to go into the future. As I see, I know it's a completely different subject, but in our minds is the statue of Colston toppling off a plinth. It's just an image that we've all got, and it's a useful image for some of the big statues, the big cycles, the big, as Natasha said, there are other songs out there. It's just, and I also just okay, that's one soapbox. Let me leap from that soapbox to another soapbox, just to remind myself that although all these men have written these words and these notes, which forms the backbone of the repertoire that I know, I'm assuming that there were female singers all through that. So what did they sing? And what did they identify? I mean, what you were saying, Natasha, about parlour songs is a start, but there have always been female voices. I'm thinking back to the Monteverdi and the Mantua and the court of Mantua and back to edges. These female singers, women have always sung.
But they were only allowed to when they were allowed to, because people thought they were hosses if they did it a little in the wrong way.
Yeah.
They had to stay in their box.
Yeah. Yes. Go underground. Yes. Yeah.
Concert singing was always a more generous space. Concert singing was less public than opera. It had fewer rules around it. So the concert life has been less punitive to female singers traditionally. It's a slightly different thing. I don't think your Colston soapbox is entirely inappropriate, Roddy. I think there's a good lesson there to be learned, in the sense that I do feel that maybe the time has come where we can say, all right, this is a historic piece, and we can take it out and examine it for the curiosity that it is, and then we can put it back. We don't really need to pretend that it speaks for a totality of experience. Certainly for me, but that is how that is a decision I sort of took earlier this year, quite consciously, to the extent that I'm actually going to write about that for a book chapter next year, because it is a conflation of history and personal experience, which I think characterizes the way a lot of people come to art song. It stands for a set of abstract values, but it also stands for accretions of personal experience in their lives. When you mess with that, you're messing with something precious, and you have to do it very carefully. I'm glad you're doing this on Friday. I think it's a really it's something that more of us should be emboldened to do. And as you say, I really do hope that young singers will watch you doing this and think, well, sure, why shouldn't I? In the same way that 150 years ago, people said, well, women really shouldn't ride bicycles. It's not good for women to ride bicycles. There were so many things which were believed to be wrong. As soon as you prod it, it explodes. And you think, oh, that was a whole pile of hot air. We really don't need that anymore.
I think the thing Roddy just said about Cheryl's piece is what interests me so much about working with song, is that I think we could all program stuff in a much more interesting way, so that we kind of shine a light on different aspects of life through art song. And I know when I was really lucky in that I was the one playing for Cheryl's piece when it was first premiered, and then I made the first disc of it, and it was so awesome putting it side by side with the Schumann. And then last year I also did a piece by Helen Grime, which was also a response to that piece, and it's a completely different beast from Cheryl's. Also, I think an absolute masterpiece. It's a great work. And there's something about having a new voice placed next door, and it seems to kind of shine lights on both works.
Do you think that's something that leader audiences need a little bit of encouraging towards? Do they seem resistant to it, or is it something they...
Not really, no. I think anything that gives them a kind of way in, I think is a really great tool. And when we did Cheryl's piece, it was for Opera North. It was received really well. And when we did Helen's piece, it was at Wigmore Hall, and also it went down really well there as well. And I think I get slightly frustrated when you're told that art song is a really hard sell and that it's a slightly out of date art form. I just do not believe that at all. I think it concentrates everything down to the most precise nugget of life if it's done well. And when you get a really brilliant voice like Cheryl's or like Helen's. It's allowing us to really kind of dig deep into what it means to be alive and to cope with life and to deal with these things. And for me, then putting it alongside a work that was written a couple of 100 years before, yeah, it kind of shines a light on both works then.
So if I can do another repertoire shout out, this is for Joe and Carolyn for the Hugh Watkins Larkin cycle, which is two men writing about a woman's experience. But I was in tears when I received that to review. And I thought, that speaks to me. That tells me something about a three-dimensional life, which is not something that the Schumann gives me anymore.
Mm. Those were also really interesting, those pieces and those poems for me, because the Larkin they don't reflect my way of thinking at all. They don't reflect my personality at all. I'm not that cynical, I'm not that sort of cold about things in that sense. I'm also not the naive young maid of the Schumann or the whatever we read into her. So in all these things there is that where do I find this person? Who's saying these things? I mean, back to everything that Alice has said about you're a human being, and you and you find that voice, and you not literal voice, but and that, so those by the same token were also not a reflection of what I felt, and it's kind of interesting. But they are brilliant pieces.
They are very brilliant. And the other recent discovery was the Boulanger Clairière cycle, which is
they're amazing.
They are so beautiful.
I don't know those.
If we're talking about gender, then this is a female composer writing male experience, if we want to put it in that particular box. They are utterly beautiful songs, and again I was spellbound, and I was glad to be able to discover them. I was glad that the reviewing brings all of these juicy things in the post every month. I don't know necessarily if I would have looked out for that otherwise, but
is that Nicholas Pan's CD?
Yes, sorry, it's not Pan, it is Pan, you're right. And Myra Huang is playing for him, and it's just spellbinding. And again, I stopped in my tracks and I thought, this says something to me about the kind of person I am. It's terribly solipsistic, I know all of this. We don't always have to identify ourselves in this music, but there is so much music out there. I don't really know how to empower young musicians to go out and find it, to feel that they can sing it in competitions, that they can perform it in their recitals. Something has to change, that people feel that they can go and take those artistic risks,
But then that's what people like Roddy and Alice and, maybe me, we're of the generation that can afford to be brave because we've established something, and perhaps that then helps the younger generation to say, they can do it, I can do it, and it's sort of, and push it further then.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So Madeline, what would your generation, since we're talking about generations now, what would your generation need?
Oh, I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to be the flag holder for that sort of spot. Well, no, I was, to be fair, it was a very fair comment, but something that was said to me the other day, I was looking at doing some programming, and what was said was, you can't earn money singing that. I guess they mean at this point, but programming stuff like that as a young singer, if there's not the demand or the funding, perhaps it's a top-down thing that maybe needs to change. But as you say, people do want to go with the safe things, and sometimes it pays off. It depends who the panelist is, and if we're talking about competitions. So I'm not sure whether it needs to be a mind shift, or like a way that more competitions based at stuff like Boulanger, or I'm sure there is one, but I don't know about it.
I think some of it, sorry, just to butt in, is that we should just trust a bit more, because I've been kind of learning on the job doing this gig up in Leeds, which I absolutely love, and I'm always amazed when every week, until we had this year's festival pulled, you have your box office sheet through, And this year, the gig that was selling best was Messiaen Poem pour me. And I put that in because I absolutely love that piece, and I thought I just want to be able to play it again. And I thought that'll be like a really hard sell, you know. And I think we should just trust a bit more. Audiences do have a thirst for this stuff. We just have to present it in a way that they want to soak it up.
Yeah, I agree. I stewarded for a lot of classical concerts, and you'd always get people saying, I heard this in 95, like, it's such a treat to get these things again and to be able to see it presented. So I think, yeah, completely agree. There are proper buffs out there. So even like the most obscure piece of music, they would have probably been there at the premiere or something like that.
I think also one of the lovely things about the pandemic is that it has allowed opportunities for this kind of conversation to happen. Because normally, when would we ever be able to get this group of people together in the same place for an hour and a half to actually have the important conversation and then put it out there for everyone to see? And I guess I hope in a way that we can transition that to after the pandemic and try and open up these conversations to more people, so that it's not just the social media argument happening online, but a proper conversation that happens instead.
I think it wouldn't necessarily have occurred to us to have done something like this beforehand. You know, we've had to find this different way of communicating, and so yeah, if it becomes a positive, that's.
It's also,
I'd still rather be sitting in the pub with you all.
It says a lot also about the benefit of the festival. I mean, actually, what Joe's saying about, you know, you've an events guide for a thing that is you already love the thing. You're going to go to a bunch of stuff around the thing, and therefore you are going to get that concentration of people who are prepared to trust a director of a festival if they know that director well and they've had positive experiences there before. So once you've got the kind of critical mass of people, then actually you can really start pushing boundaries in a way that perhaps if you're trying to program one concert in a venue that you're not very familiar with otherwise becomes a harder proposition, particularly if you are at the beginning of your career and you're still trying to kind of find a niche. Whereas actually if you're pulled into something 3 days long, 2 weeks long, there's more opportunity to get those, and also get those conversations going, because those are the places where there is density of folks like us who are around and would be happy to, ideally over a point, have a kind of conversation like this.
And I think the same model applies to recordings, in the sense that, you know, how magazines decide what is reviewed is a really fascinating thing to explore. And very often some unusual repertoire will make a CD, will attract the eye of a magazine editor and push for a review. Whereas, you know, sometimes trotting that beaten path one too many times can sort of risk not worth taking. So I completely agree with Joe that I think, you know, we can trust audiences, we can trust listeners a little bit more. Maybe they need one repetition or two, but they do open up to new ideas. I think that's a far better way than just always playing it safe.
I mean, because also, I mean, Joe and Roddy and I were really looking forward to doing our performance at Leeds and again in Manchester this year. Just this idea of the, can the girl sing this, can the boy sing that, because we really wanted the audience interaction. You know, it's particularly sort of galling that that's gone for us this year, because that was in itself feeling quite experimental, and we didn't know how it would go.
We can't do it without the audiences, much as we may want to defy them. We do love them. I miss them.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I miss all of you. I miss everybody here.
Yeah. Yes.
Very odd, all of this.
Yeah. It's going to, the hardest thing about that I can imagine stepping on stage on Friday, the hardest thing is not being able to sing it to people. So I kind of feels like a rehearsal. I've been doing some examining for one of the conservatoires, and all these students have been sending their online presentations, and it's particularly, of course, the comic songs that without an audience, you just think there's nobody to bounce off. It's just so weird. So, yeah, quite right, Alice. Bring them back.
So returning to Frauenliebe und Leben, my children need dinner now.
There wasn't a song about that. I don't remember there being a song about that.
Yeah, well, that's the bit that the men didn't want to acknowledge, isn't it, Alice?
How very rude. I made mine tea tonight.
You're a new man, though, but Chamiso most definitely was not, and I don't think Robert Schumann did much in that department either. So I love the 19th century, but I am glad I am not in it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You all know the last line of the La Belle Chanson Madagascar.
No.
It's just the most gorgeous thing. It's this ardent love song, and all this dancing, and all the women dancing around the campfire. And at the end, he just says, "Go on, get the dinner on." We're talking about the male experience. That's pretty. Yeah.
No comment.
I'm not host. I'm gonna leave that for Anna to wrap the whole thing up. But it just gives me so much food for thought. Everything that all of you have said, and it gives me so much inspiration to go out on stage and put it up like a cricketer of any gender, and just go into bat for an idea. I'm not quite sure what the idea is yet, but I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm hoping I'll find out at some point during the afternoon on Friday, and then off into the future. But the next time that a student brings in a piece for coaching and says, "I wanted to sing this," and anybody in the audience goes, "Ooh," that that's fun. I want people to sing anything that they can sing. We'll see.
Maybe this will be a Frauenliebe renaissance, in the sense if we do enough, don't want to sound preachy, but if we do enough work outside, Frauenliebe won't feel like such a, that lifestyle will be a choice, and it won't feel like, maybe we can fall back in love with it, and we will, because we've got your lovely dulcet tones to listen to. So
yeah, hold on to that thought.
Roddy, I can send the spoof outraged tweet at 2:02 on Friday afternoon.
Thank you. I would say to Joe, at least with social distancing, there won't be much of a picket outside. So
you say this.
Yeah.
Be brave.
Oh, well, thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. I think I found it particularly fascinating, and I hope you all have too. And fingers crossed it helps Roddy get across the message that he wants to get across. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Good luck, Roddy.
Good luck. Toy, toy.
Good luck, Roddy.